The garden had been locked for 4 years, which was precisely why Aurelia Bramwell was standing waist deep in its fountain, laughing so hard she could not see, while a dog the size of a small carriage horse stood over her with an expression of profound professional satisfaction. By the time the leaves turned that year, the Duke of Larkspur would not be able to remember what silence in that garden had sounded like. But that came later. First there was the rumour, and the rumour was this, that Julian Voss, 9th Duke of Larkspur, had crippled the last man in the county who dared to defy him, and that no sensible person went up the drive at Larkspur Hall without a very good reason and an even better exit plan. Aurelia had neither. She had an advertisement, 3 weeks old, folded soft along its creases, from being carried in a coat pocket that was not entirely waterproof. And she had the particular stubbornness of a woman who had been warned off things her whole life and found the warnings. On the whole, unreliable, Farrow Green had told her not to go. Farrow Green told her not to go the way it told her not to walk past the old mill after dark, or not to trust a man who complimented her handwriting before her face, with relish and at length, and never once with anything resembling proof. So she went anyway. But first, the rumour deserves its due, because a rumour of that size does not build itself out of nothing. And this one had been 2 years in the growing, fed by every dinner table in the district, until nobody quite remembered which parts were true. 3 weeks before she stood dripping in a dead duchess's fountain, Aurelia had been sitting at her father's old writing desk, hers now, though she still thought of it as his, copying a bill of sale for the miller's widow in exchange for 2 eggs and a promise of more when the hens recovered their opinions, when Mrs. Otley from the bakery arrived with news and a currant loaf. In roughly that order of urgency. "He's advertised for a clerk," Mrs. Otley said, setting the loaf down like evidence. "Larkspur Hall. A clerk, if you please, to sort the estate ledgers, because the last one fled in the night with his coat only half buttoned." Fled from what? Aurelia asked, not looking up, because she had learned that the fastest way to hear the whole of a story was to seem only mildly interested in it. "From him," said Mrs. Otley, in the tone of a woman naming something biblical. "The Duke. You know what he did to Barnaby Croft." Aurelia did know, in the way one knows the moon is far away without ever having measured the distance herself. Everyone knew. Barnaby Croft, who owned the water meadow 2 farms over, and had once been the loudest man in 3 parishes, now walked with a stick and a limp so pronounced that children imitated it behind his back, and it was universally agreed, by people who had not been present, using information from people who also had not been present, that the Duke of Larkspur had done this to him over some dispute nobody could name precisely, in some manner nobody could describe usefully, 2 years ago, after which Croft had gone quiet and Larkspur had gone quieter, and the 2 facts had married each other in the village imagination, and produced a legend. "He hasn't smiled since his wife died," Mrs. Otley added, dropping her voice as though smiling were a crime that might still be prosecuted. 4 years now. Mrs. Fairley says the whole house has gone still as a held breath. "That sounds," said Aurelia, like a man who could use a clerk who is not afraid of him. "That sounds," said Mrs. Otley, like a woman who has not met him. She had not. That was, in fact, rather the point. Aurelia Bramwell was 23, in possession of her late father's excellent hand for figures, his complete filing system, his conviction that a document properly read was worth 10 opinions loudly held, and almost nothing else, her father's practice having died with him, and left her his ledgers, his law books, and a great deal of unpaid work from grateful neighbours. She had buried him 2 years ago, with a composure the village still discussed, and she had gone on laughing since, at market carts that lost their wheels, and at her own frequent spectacular bad luck, because grief, in her experience, was not improved by also being humourless about it. Attention is the beginning of love, her father used to say, of documents and of people both, and she had believed him enough to build a small, stubborn life on it. So on a Tuesday in early October, under a sky the colour of a well-used teaspoon, she walked the 4 miles to Larkspur Hall with her father's letter of introduction, her own advertisement clipping, and a paper twist of larkspur seed in her coat pocket that she had been meaning to plant for a fortnight, and had simply never found the ground for. She found the ground rather sooner than she expected. The main drive at Larkspur Hall was wide, raked, and entirely unmuddy, which made it easy to avoid, and therefore easy for Aurelia, spotting a gap in a yew hedge that promised a shortcut, and being constitutionally unable to resist a shortcut, to abandon in favour of what turned out to be the one garden in all of Larkspur Hall that nobody had entered in 4 years. She did not know this. She knew only that the hedge opened onto an overgrown paradise of collapsed roses and waist-high grass, silent in a way that felt deliberate rather than accidental, and that somewhere in the middle of it there was a stone fountain, dry and cracked and full of leaves, and that the quickest way across it appeared to be along its rim. It was not the quickest way across it. She discovered this with her whole body, arms out, dignity briefly airborne, landing in 6 inches of cold rainwater and a century of silt with a splash that startled 2 pigeons and, from somewhere behind the roses, a dog. The dog arrived first. He was enormous, grey-brown, built along the lines of a small and companionable boulder, and he regarded her from the fountain's edge with his head tilted at an angle that suggested deep philosophical inquiry into her life choices, before stepping delicately into the water beside her and putting one enormous paw on her knee, as if to confirm she was real. "I am," Aurelia told him, "having the best morning of the year, and it has only just started raining on the inside of my boots." She began, helplessly, to laugh, not politely, not for anyone's benefit, but the real, unperformed kind that came up out of her like water, finding a crack. And the packet of larkspur seed chose that exact moment to slip from her soaked pocket and scatter itself, small and hopeful, across the surface of the fountain and into the mud around it. The dog barked once, with the air of a magistrate calling a room to order. "Diogenes," said a voice from the hedge, in the tone of a man reciting a fact he had recited many times and no longer expected anyone to obey, "do not encourage her." Aurelia looked up. The Duke of Larkspur was standing where the hedge broke, tall, dark-coated, entirely dry, wearing the expression of a man who had come out to examine a drainage problem and instead found a stranger sitting in his dead wife's fountain laughing at the sky. "Are you injured?" he said. It was not quite a question, only my dignity, Aurelia said, and it was never load-bearing. She held up a dripping hand, not for help but for inspection, the way one might present evidence. "Is this garden meant to be entered, or was that the joke I've just walked into?" Something moved behind his eyes, brief, immediately arrested, gone before it could be called anything so definite as an expression, and he said, "No one enters this garden," in a voice that closed the sentence like a door, and then, after a pause exactly long enough to notice, "You should get up. The water is not clean." "Neither am I, currently," Aurelia said, and accepted the hand he had not, until that moment offered. He pulled her up as if lifting a crate whose weight he had misjudged, too fast, so that she came up out of the water directly in front of him, close enough to see that his eyes were an ordinary grey, and that he had not, in fact, expected to be standing this near to a laughing, dripping, thoroughly unbothered stranger in the one place on his property where he came. Alone. To not think about his wife. "You're trespassing," he said. "I'm applying," Aurelia said, and produced, from an inner pocket that had somehow stayed dry through the whole catastrophe, a slightly damp advertisement clipping. "For the position of clerk. I understand the last one left rather suddenly." The Duke looked at the clipping. He looked at her, soaked to the waist, seeds scattered around her feet like she had been sowing chaos on purpose. Diogenes sat down between them with a thump and a sigh, as though settling in to watch a play he already knew the ending of. "You'll want dry clothes," the Duke said finally, which was not a yes, and turned and walked back through the hedge without waiting to see whether she followed, which everyone in that garden understood, even the dog, was as close to a yes as the Duke of Larkspur had given anyone in 4 years. He told himself, walking back to the house at a pace slightly faster than the drainage problem strictly required, that he had simply been startled. Servants did not laugh in that garden. No one laughed in that garden, which was, after all, the entire design of it, a locked wing without walls. 4 years of silence grown up over the roses like ivy, tended by absolutely no one on the explicit instruction that it be left exactly as his wife had left it. He had not examined this reasoning at any great length in some time. He did not examine it now. Behind him, Mrs. Fairley, the housekeeper, met him at the terrace door with the particular alertness of a woman who has heard a splash, a bark, and laughter from a garden that had produced none of those sounds in 4 years, and required urgently an explanation. "There is a young woman in the west garden," the Duke said, applying for the clerk's position. "See that she is given dry clothes, and shown to my study within the hour." He paused at the door. "And do not let Diogenes near the good rugs. He is wet." "Yes, Your Grace," said Mrs. Fairley, and watched him go with an expression she would later describe to Hobbs, the butler, over tea, as hopeful, though I would deny it under oath. Hobbs, for his part, when told the story second-hand within the half-hour, servants' information travelling roughly 4 times faster than the post in a house that size, allowed one eyebrow to rise by what Mrs. Fairley privately estimated to be 2 millimetres, which in a man of Hobbs's professional composure constituted an outburst. "A woman fell in the west garden," he repeated, "and his Grace did not have her removed. He offered her his hand," said Mrs. Fairley. Hobbs set down his teacup with the exaggerated care of a man handling unstable news. "Well," he said, "that is new information," and went to find a ledger in which, 4 years ago, he had begun privately recording the Duke's smiles, expecting it to remain empty, and which currently stood, he checked, out of long habit, though he already knew the number, at 0. That would not remain true for very much longer, though nobody in the house, least of all the Duke of Larkspur, would admit to counting. The clothes Mrs. Fairley produced belonged, Aurelia gathered from the careful way they were handled, to nobody currently living in the house, and she did not ask whose they had been, because there are some silences a sensible person does not disturb on a first visit. She was given a cup of tea strong enough to stand a spoon in, a fire built up in a small sitting room nobody seemed to use, and 40 minutes to dry her hair and rehearse the sentence I am entirely capable of reading a ledger. Your Grace. Whatever you may have heard about my swimming. She did not need it. When she was shown into the study, a long room of dark wood and taller windows, its shelves in the particular disorder of a system abandoned mid-collapse, the Duke of Larkspur was standing over a desk buried in receipts, with the expression of a man reviewing a battlefield after a defeat he had not been present for. The previous clerk, he said, without preamble, left everything in the order he found it convenient to leave it in, which is to say no order whatsoever. I need the tenant accounts separated from the household accounts, the household accounts reconciled against the quarter, and I need it done by a person who will not require me to explain, more than once, why a figure does not match. May I see the discrepancy that made him run? Aurelia asked, already crossing to the desk, and if the Duke found it curious that she assumed there was one specific discrepancy rather than a general incompetence. He did not say so, only handed her a ledger open to a page he had clearly stared at a great many times without result. She read it the way her father had taught her to read anything important, twice, once for the numbers, and once for the story the numbers were pretending not to tell, and found the error inside 4 minutes, a rent payment recorded twice, under 2 different tenant names, because a careless hand had transposed a digit in the cottage number. "You're Mr. Alder in Cottage 4 hasn't underpaid you," she said. "Your ledger has invented a tenant who does not exist, and is generously imagining he pays you twice." The Duke looked at the page. He looked at her. Something crossed his face, small, immediate, filed away before it could become anything so reckless as pleasure, and Hobbs, who had entered at that exact moment with a fresh pot of tea and every intention of eavesdropping professionally, would later report to Mrs. Fairley that he had personally witnessed the Duke of Larkspur's mouth attempt to smile, achieve perhaps one corner of one, and retreat. "You're hired," the Duke said, in the tone of a man conceding a point in an argument he had not realised he was losing. Provisionally, Aurelia repeated, and could not quite keep the corner of her own mouth from doing something similar. "On what condition? That you stay out of my garden." "That," she said, "seems like exactly the sort of promise a person makes fully intending to break." Hobbs, pouring tea with the studied blankness of a man who has heard nothing, filed that exchange away as well, on the growing theory, not yet spoken aloud to anyone, not even Mrs. Fairley, that the household's 4-year winter might, provisionally, be nearing its end. The gate at the far edge of the west garden had needed a new latch for 4 years, in the specific sense that it had been needing one since roughly a fortnight after the old Duchess died, when nobody had troubled to mend it, and nobody had troubled to say why. It was therefore a matter of some interest to the household when the Duke of Larkspur began, within a week of hiring his new clerk, to develop an unusually detailed concern for its condition. "He's been to the gate twice this morning," Mrs. Fairley reported to Hobbs on the 7th day, in the manner of a woman filing a weather observation. "The latch is perfectly sound. I mended it myself in the spring." "Perhaps he forgot," said Hobbs. "He does not forget things, Mr. Hobbs. That is rather his whole character." They were both, in the discreet way of servants who have decided a thing is happening and intend to watch it happen without ever admitting they are watching. Entirely correct. The Duke had found, in the space of a week, an astonishing number of reasons to pass through rooms where his clerk happened to be working. A query about a roof he had not previously mentioned needing looked at, a request for her opinion on a hedge, a sudden, and never before, expressed interest in whether the estate's beehives were sited correctly, none of which required his personal attendance, all of which received it. Aurelia noticed. She noticed the way a woman notices weather, without commentary, filing it as pleasant and declining to examine it too closely for fear of frightening it off. What she did examine with considerably more rigour was the estate itself, which she had by the second week largely rescued from its own paperwork. The tenant accounts separated and reconciled. A boundary dispute between two cottagers resolved by producing the original survey rather than the shouting match that had preceded her arrival, and a standing complaint from the parish about tithe records untangled in an afternoon that had taken the previous clerk 3 unproductive weeks to fail at. "You read the original document," the Duke said, watching her lay 2 conflicting land agreements side by side and resolve a decade of quiet cottage resentment with a single underlined clause. Everyone else simply repeats what they were told the document said. Most disputes, Aurelia said, are not disagreements about facts. They're disagreements about which version of the story people prefer to have been told. She looked up. It's usually cheaper to just go and read the paper. That is, the Duke said after a pause, an alarmingly sensible way to run a household, and Hobbs. Arranging correspondence on a side table, with his back deliberately turned, observed in the window's reflection the corner of the Duke's mouth lift. Hold, 1 second, 2, he counted. Out of a habit he was beginning to be unable to break, and subside. It was not yet a smile. It would be recorded in the ledger Hobbs had begun keeping, and continued to deny keeping, as an almost, filed under the date, corrected the following morning, to note that the duration had, in fact, been closer to 3 seconds than 2, because accuracy mattered. The servant chorus, by the second week, had developed an entire private vocabulary for the Duke's condition. Mrs. fairly maintained that his appetite had improved. The cook, a broad, unshakable woman named Mrs. Kettle, reported that he had complimented the bread twice in 1 week, which had not happened, by her own count, since the funeral. A stable boy named Peter, who had no official role in the intelligence network, but contributed enthusiastically anyway, noted that the Duke had ridden out singing under his breath on Thursday, badly, and had stopped the moment he realised he was doing it. "He is thawing," Mrs. fairly announced, over the servants' supper, with the confidence of a woman reading a thermometer. "He is pretending nothing has changed," Hobbs corrected, which is nearly as good evidence. Aurelia herself thought less about the Duke's thaw than about the garden, which she had, despite her promise, entered exactly twice more, once by genuine accident, chasing a runaway hat, and once entirely on purpose, because a garden that had been locked for 4 years had begun to seem to her less like a rule and more like a wound with a fence around it, and she would admit only to herself, never been able to leave a wound unexamined. It was on the second deliberate visit that she found the low stone bench near the collapsed roses, and beneath a fall of ivy, a small brass plate she had to clear with her sleeve to read Marianne. Beloved, no dates, no further explanation, just the one word doing the work of an entire eulogy, and the ivy that had been allowed, deliberately or not, to grow over it until it was nearly unreadable. She did not tell the Duke she had found it. But that evening, walking the lane back toward the servants' entrance, where she now lodged during the week, Farrow Green being a long walk for a daily commute, and Mrs. Fairley having quietly arranged a room without consulting anyone who might have objected, she passed the Duke coming the opposite way, and stopped, because something in his face suggested he wanted, for once, to be stopped. Her name was Marianne, he said, without introduction, as though continuing a conversation they had already been having for years. My wife. She's been dead 4 years, 2 months, and 11 days, Not that anyone in this house permits me to lose count. I know, Aurelia said gently. I read the plate. He looked at her sharply, and then, unexpectedly, did not look away. Nobody reads that plate. I had it put where it wouldn't be read. Then you put it somewhere a person who reads things for a living was always going to find it, Aurelia said, which strikes me as either very careless or not entirely intentional. He did not answer that directly, which she would come to learn was, with him, its own kind of answer. Instead, he said, My mother died when I was young enough not to remember her voice, only that the house went quiet afterward, and my father decided quiet was correct, and taught me to think so too. Marianne made this house loud again. When she died, I did not know how to keep it that way without her, so I let it go quiet, and told myself that was respect. Was it? I don't know any more, the Duke said, and it was the longest honest sentence anyone in Farrow Green or Larkspur Hall had heard him produce in 4 years, delivered in the broken, self-interrupted way of a man unused to the exercise, each clause arriving as though it cost him something to locate. I know the piano hasn't been played. I know I had a wing of this house closed because I couldn't decide whether opening it was a betrayal or a mercy, so I decided nothing at all, for 4 years, which I am beginning to suspect was its own kind of decision. Aurelia thought of her own father's desk, still arranged exactly as he had left it, and of the 2 years she had spent laughing at market carts, rather than examine why she could not yet bring herself to move his inkwell. My father died 2 years ago, she said. I laugh at everything now, not because it isn't sad, because if I stop, I'm afraid I'll simply stop. And he would have found that an enormous waste of a life he worked very hard to give me. She looked at him. Grief doesn't ask permission to stay, but it doesn't have to run the house, either. You could open one door, just to see. The Duke looked at her for a long moment in the fading October light, with the expression of a man being offered a key he had assumed was lost, and said only, It's late. You should go in before Mrs. Fairley sends a search party, which was not agreement, and was not refusal, and which Aurelia understood, walking the rest of the lane in a silence that felt for the first time like the beginning of something, rather than the absence of it, to be exactly the kind of answer a man gives when he has not yet decided to trust himself with a better one. The rain came in earnest 3 days later, the sort of steady, business-like autumn rain that applied itself to the Larkspur roof with the thoroughness of a tradesman being paid by the hour. And it was this rain, more than any decision either of them made, that was responsible for what happened next. Aurelia had gone into the west garden to rescue a basket of tools left out by the gardener's boy. The same gate, still unlatched, the Duke's repeated attentions to it having produced, so far, no actual repair, when the sky opened without warning, and she was obliged to take shelter in the old garden folly at the wood's edge, a small stone summer-house, with a roof considerably more reliable than its reputation suggested. She was not alone there for long. You, the Duke said, arriving at a dead run and considerably wetter than she was, are going to catch your death standing in doorways during weather like this. I was rescuing your tools, Aurelia said. You're welcome. He looked, briefly, as though he might argue the point, and then simply sat down on the folly's stone bench instead, water running from his sleeves, and put his head back against the wall, with the particular exhaustion of a man who has been outrunning a feeling for 4 years, and has just discovered that the feeling runs exactly as fast as he does. They sat like that for some time, listening to the rain do its work on the roof and the garden both, and it was Aurelia, eventually, who broke the silence, not because she minded it, But because she had learned that some silences want breaking and some don't, and this one, she judged, did "Tell me about the piano," she said. He turned his head. "How do you know about the piano?" Mrs. fairly mentioned it. Once, and then looked like she'd said something she shouldn't have. The Duke was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all, and then he said, "Marianne played badly." Enthusiastically, and badly every evening, whether or not anyone asked her to, and I complained about it constantly, and I would give a great deal to hear it again even once. Badly, tonight, he said this without drama. The way a man states a fact he has examined from every angle and found no way to make smaller. I had it moved to the locked wing after she died. I told myself it was because I couldn't bear the silence where the sound used to be. I think now it might have been because I couldn't bear anyone else's hands on it either. "That's not selfishness," Aurelia said. "That's just love that hasn't found somewhere new to go yet." He looked at her properly then, rain-soaked and unguarded in a way she had not yet seen from him, and said, "You have a talent for saying the exact thing that undoes an argument I've been building for 4 years. I read documents for a living," Aurelia said. "I'm very good at finding the clause everyone else missed." Something in his face moved, not the almost smile this time, but something quieter and more permanent underneath it. The look of a man recalculating a sum he had assumed was fixed, and he reached over, slowly, and took her hand, not as a gesture but almost as an experiment. The way one touches a stove to confirm it is in fact still hot. "I am not," he said, "a man who does this easily." "I hadn't noticed," Aurelia said, entirely straight-faced, and felt his hand tighten around hers in what she would later insist to no one was the first genuine laugh she ever got out of him, even though it made no sound at all, just a breath, caught and released, the corners of his mouth lifting and, for once, staying. It was small. It was real. And 1/2 a mile away in the kitchen, entirely unaware that anything of note had occurred, Mrs. fairly happened to glance at the kitchen clock as the rain eased, and would swear afterward, though she could never explain why, precisely. She had felt the need to check that it had been 20 minutes past 4 in the afternoon, on a Thursday, which she wrote down in the household diary she also denied keeping, under the single word, progress. That evening, before the folly had fully dried, Aurelia knelt at the edge of the fountain and pressed the last of her spilled larkspur seed into the softened earth along its rim, and the Duke, standing over her with his coat still damp, said nothing about trespassing at all. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which Hobbs would later observe was becoming, in his professional opinion, a suspicious day of the week for this household, and it came at nearly the same hour as a visitor nobody had invited. Lady Fenwick, mother of the late Duchess Marianne, arriving in a carriage with the particular unhurried menace of a woman who has decided, after 4 years of restraint, that restraint has run its course. She was announced into the study where Aurelia happened to be working, took one long look at the ledgers, the reorganised shelves, and the young woman standing rather too comfortably behind the Duke's desk, and said, without preamble, "So you're the one." "I'm the clerk," Aurelia said. "You're the one my daughter's dog follows into gardens," Lady Fenwick said, "and the one whose name my son-in-law has mentioned in 3 separate letters this month, which is 3 more mentions of anything at all than I have received from him in the previous 2 years combined." She sat, uninvited, in the chair across from the desk, and regarded Aurelia with an attention so precise it felt almost affectionate, though nothing in her expression admitted to affection yet. "I have come to determine whether you are a fortune hunter, a fool, or something more interesting than either. I would suggest, Aurelia said, that you ask me questions rather than guess, since you strike me as a woman who trusts evidence over impression. Something flickered behind Lady Fenwick's eyes, approval quickly suppressed, and she began, methodically, to interrogate Aurelia's father, her education, her income, her intentions, the exact contents of her larkspur planting, and why of all flowers she had chosen the one that shared the estate's name. Aurelia answered each question directly, without flourish, admitting freely that she had no fortune, no particular ambition beyond good work honestly done, and no intention of pretending Marianne had not existed ever to anyone. I found her bench, Aurelia said, when the questioning turned, inevitably, to the garden. I read the plate. I didn't move the ivy off it, because it wasn't mine to move. But I did plant something new near it, because I thought a garden that only remembers is not so different from a garden that has been left to die, and she seemed, from everything your daughter left behind, like a woman who would rather be remembered growing than remembered locked. Lady Fenwick was silent for a long moment, her composure, for the first time, visibly costing her something. My daughter, she said finally, would have adored you. And I did not think, when I got into that carriage this morning, that I would ever say such a thing about a stranger sitting at my son-in-law's desk. She stood, gathering her gloves with brisk, final movements. You may stay. Provisionally, that word again, Aurelia said, and Lady Fenwick, halfway to the door, permitted herself something that was almost, though she would have denied it under oath, a smile of her own. It was into this fragile new piece that the second piece of news arrived, delivered by Hobbs with the flat, careful tone he reserved for information he suspected would matter more than its size suggested. Barnaby Croft had lodged a legal claim against the Larkspur Water meadow, citing an old debt he alleged the late Duke's father had never settled, and was, according to the letter, prepared to take the matter to court unless compensated immediately and handsomely. Croft, the Duke said, reading the letter with an expression Aurelia had not seen on him before. Not fear, not even anger, but the tired, familiar weariness of a man revisiting an old wound he had hoped was closed. Of course. You'll want to tell me what actually happened to him, Aurelia said quietly, because the village has been telling me a very different story for a month, and I would rather hear the true one from you than let the rumour keep doing your talking. The Duke set the letter down. 2 years ago, Croft and my father-in-law disputed the meadow boundary. I inherited the argument along with the title. Croft came here in a temper, was told correctly that the original survey did not support his claim, and rode off in such a fury that he tried to jump the boundary fence rather than use the gate, to make what I can only assume he intended as a dramatic exit. He rubbed a hand over his face. His horse balked. He did not. He broke his leg badly enough that it never set right, and rather than admit he'd injured himself out of his own temper, he let it be known, without ever quite saying so outright, that I had done something to him. I did not correct it. I told myself I did not care what Farrow Green believed. The truth is I could not find the energy that autumn to correct anything at all. He looked at her. I have paid his physician's fees every quarter since, quietly, because the argument was mine to have handled better, even if the fall was entirely his own doing. Hobbs has been sending the draft. No one asked why. I did wonder, Hobbs murmured from the doorway, why your Grace insisted the physician's account be paid before your own tailor's. There it is, Aurelia said. That's not a man who crippled anyone. That's a man who's been quietly paying for a stranger's bad temper for 2 years, and letting the whole county think him a villain, rather than explain himself once. It was easier, the Duke admitted, than talking about any of it. It's rarely easier, Aurelia said for very long, and reached for her father's old case of papers, in which, she was fairly certain, the original Larkspur boundary survey, drawn and witnessed, in fact, by her own father decades before, in his careful, unmistakable hand, was still filed exactly where he had left it. Croft arrived at Larkspur Hall 2 days later in a hired trap, blustering before he had even fully descended from it, and found waiting for him not a duke inclined to argue, but a young woman in a plain grey dress, laying 2 documents side by side on the study desk, with the calm, devastating efficiency of a woman who has never once lost an argument to a man who raised his voice instead of his. Evidence. This, Aurelia said, tapping the first paper, is the survey your claim rests on. And this, tapping the second, is the original, drawn by my father, witnessed by 2 men still living in this parish, which shows the boundary exactly where the Duke says it is, dated 11 years before the debt you're alleging was ever incurred. She looked up at him, not unkindly. You're welcome to take it to court, Mr. Croft. I'll happily testify to the provenance of both documents myself. Croft looked at the papers. He looked at the Duke, silent and unmoved behind his desk. He looked, finally, at his own leg, which had done more to build his legend than any duke ever had, and something in his bluster went, all at once out of him like air from a bad bladder. I'll withdraw the claim, he said stiffly, and left without another word, climbing back into his trap with the particular hurried dignity of a man who has been caught out and would very much like everyone to forget they had witnessed it. No one at Larkspur Hall ever saw him again in any capacity requiring documents, and the county's memory of the whole affair began. From that week. Its slow correction helped along, Hobbs noted with satisfaction, by Mrs. Otley the baker, whose gossip network worked precisely as fast in reverse as it had in the original telling. Lady Fenwick, informed of the resolution over tea, declared herself entirely unsurprised, and then, in the manner of a woman who had decided the household's morals required one final adjustment, announced that propriety demanded Aurelia return to Farrow Green for a week or 2, chaperoned and respectable, while matters at the Hall, she did not specify which matters, settled themselves properly. The Duke did not argue with her. He merely watched Aurelia's cart disappear down the drive with the stricken, silent look of a man who had spent 4 years learning to live with a house gone quiet, and had just discovered exactly how much louder it had become in 3 short weeks, and how unwilling he now was to let it go quiet again. Farrow Green in the 2nd week of November was cold, small, and Aurelia found considerably less interesting than it had been 3 weeks earlier, which she attributed, privately and with some irritation at herself, to the absence of a certain grey-eyed duke and his enormous judgmental dog. She copied deeds. She helped Mrs. Otley with the shop accounts. She told herself several times a day that this was simply her life resuming its proper shape, and believed it less each time she said it. The Duke, at Larkspur Hall, was managing the separation with considerably less composure, a fact the entire household observed with the fascinated horror of people watching a controlled fire escape its hearth. He had, in the space of 6 days, reorganised his own study twice, ridden to the boundary fence and back 4 times without any drainage-related excuse remaining plausible, and been discovered by Mrs. fairly standing in the doorway of the locked wing with a key in his hand and no clear memory, he admitted, of having decided to fetch it. "Open it, Mrs." Fairlie said simply. or don't, Your Grace. But stop standing in the doorway deciding. She isn't here to watch you not decide anymore, and frankly, neither am I. He opened it. The piano stood exactly where it had always stood, dust-sheeted, and beneath the sheet the keys, when he finally lifted the lid, were as yellowed and imperfect as he remembered. And he sat down before them for the first time in 4 years, and played, badly, the one tune his wife had loved best, all the way through without stopping. While Hobbs stood unnoticed in the hall outside, with his hand pressed briefly, uncharacteristically, over his own eyes. It was Diogenes, in the end, who broke the standoff, having developed over 3 weeks an attachment to Aurelia that no household member had successfully argued him out of. On the 7th day of her absence he simply left, at a dead trot, down the 4 miles of lane to Farrow Green, and arrived at the Bramwell cottage muddy, triumphant, and entirely unrepentant, forcing the Duke to follow him the next morning on horseback, with his hair not quite brushed, and an explanation he had not yet fully composed. He found her in the cottage garden, kneeling in the cold dirt with a trowel, and he dismounted before the horse had properly stopped, which was unlike him, and stood there for a moment, simply looking at her the way a man looks at a door he has finally decided to walk through. "You came all this way," Aurelia said, standing and brushing dirt from her knees to retrieve your dog. "I came," the Duke said, "because the house has gone quiet again, and I have discovered I no longer have any patience for that particular silence." He stopped, visibly reorganizing the sentence he'd ridden 4 miles to deliver, the words arriving broken and out of order, exactly as they always did when they mattered most. "I want to marry you. I am aware this is badly timed, and worse phrased, and that I have not brought flowers, because I could not think what flower would be adequate, given that you've already planted the correct one yourself." "That's not a proposal," Aurelia said, though she was smiling in a way that suggested she did not much mind. "That's an itemized complaint. Then let me itemize properly," he said, and the words, once permitted to come, came faster, plainer, truer than anything she had heard him say. "Because you found the one error in 4 years of ledgers that actually mattered. Because you read a headstone no one else would read, and planted something living beside it instead of walking away. Because my dog trusts you more than he trusts me, which I have decided to find endearing rather than insulting. Because the piano is open again, and the garden gate has a working latch as of Tuesday, and I did not do either of those things. I did them because I could not stop thinking about a woman who fell in a fountain and laughed, instead of apologizing for it. Because the library is unbearable on the days you're not in it, and I did not know a room could be unbearable until you left one empty. Because I have spent 4 years believing quiet was respect, and you taught me, without ever once telling me to, that it was only ever fear wearing respect's clothes." He stopped, out of breath in a way that had nothing to do with the ride. "Marry me. I'm aware I'm doing this badly." "You're doing it exactly right," Aurelia said, and the laugh that came out of her then was not the polite kind, not the deflecting kind, but the full, helpless, unperformed kind she had first given him in a fountain full of drowned larkspur seed, and this time he laughed with her, really laughed, the sound rough and unpractised, and entirely genuine. 4 full seconds by her count, though she would later insist to Mrs. Fairley that she had not, in fact, been counting. "Yes," she said. Obviously, yes. He kissed her once, briefly in the cold garden with the dog barking his approval, and Mrs. Otley very visibly failing to mind her own shop window across the lane, and the whole of Farrow Green knew the news before either of them had finished saying it aloud. "And the roses come with me," Aurelia added, pulling back just far enough to make the terms clear. The wild ones by the fountain. I'm not leaving them for someone who doesn't know their names. They already have a name, the Duke said. They've had it for 4 years. I simply hadn't looked at them properly in some time. The wedding, when it came in early December, was small by the standards of dukedoms, and enormous by the standards of Farrow Green, which turned out in its entirety despite the cold, and Diogenes attended in a manner the vicar described afterward, with admirable restraint, as unauthorized. Having installed himself directly beside the altar, and refused, throughout the ceremony, to be moved by anyone but the bride. Lady Fenwick wept, loudly and without apology, informing everyone within earshot that she had never expected to attend another wedding at Larkspur Hall, and was extremely put out at how much she had enjoyed being wrong. Hobbs, standing at the back of the small chapel, permitted himself, for the first recorded time in his professional history, a smile that lasted a full 6 seconds, which Mrs. Fairley noted in the household diary with considerable satisfaction, and underlined twice. Spring came to Larkspur Hall the way it comes to gardens that have finally been allowed to remember what they were for. The West Garden, opened fully by March, ran wild and glorious with larkspur along the fountain's edge, tall spikes of blue and violet planted in 3 careful successions since that first scattered handful, and Marianne's bench sat at the centre of it, ivy cleared, plate polished. A second small plaque added beside it at Aurelia's quiet insistence, reading only, her garden, still growing. The piano was played badly and often, mostly by the new Duchess, who had no more talent for it than her predecessor, and considerably more enthusiasm, and the sound carried out across the lawns most evenings, which the household had collectively decided was the correct and permanent state of things. The locked wing stood open, its rooms aired, its rugs beaten, its silence replaced by the ordinary, occasional noise of a house being lived in properly. By the end of that first spring, Hobbes's private ledger, no longer denied, framed instead as a small joke shared openly at supper, recorded that the Duke smiled most mornings before his coffee arrived, and occasionally, on good days, before he had even finished dressing. Mrs. Fairley's household diary noted the piano's daily use, the garden's steady bloom, and, in April, the arrival of a second philosopher named Creature to the estate, a small, self-important terrier the Duchess named Epictetus, on the grounds, she said, that the household required at least one resident committed to the idea that happiness was a matter of choice rather than circumstance. Diogenes tolerated him with the weary patience of an elder statesman, and continued, as a matter of settled principle, to prefer the Duchess's company to anyone else's, including, he made clear on multiple occasions, the Duke's. Barnaby Croft was seen twice more in Farrow Green that year, walking a little straighter than before, his limp somehow less remarked upon now, that the story behind it had stopped being interesting, and by autumn he had sold the water meadow and removed himself to a cousin's estate 2 counties distant, where, as far as anyone at Larkspur Hall ever learned, he told a new and considerably more flattering version of the story to people who had never heard the old one. The larkspur seed, that first packet spilled by accident into a dry stone fountain on an October morning, had by the following June become the estate's signature planting, given now each spring in small paper twists to every tenant's daughter who asked, with the same instruction attached each time, delivered by the Duchess herself, with the particular patience of a woman who has learned that some things are worth explaining more than once, that certainty is not a prerequisite for planting, only willingness, and that the ground, given half a chance, and someone stubborn enough to kneel in it, will very often surprise you. There is a particular kind of house that goes quiet when it loses something it cannot replace, and mistakes the quiet, for a while, for peace. Larkspur Hall had been such a house for 4 winters, and then, on an ordinary Tuesday, a woman fell into its fountain, laughing, with a pocket full of seeds she had never quite found the ground for, and the house, room by room, remembered how to be loud again.